Greetings. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth, peace to people of good will. I recently noticed that I was tagged in a YouTube community post by TEOTW Ministries. Now, I appreciate the tag as I've tried to dialogue with the TEOTW twins in the past, and I found that attempting to reach out to them was a tad difficult. So that's why I appreciate them apparently reopening this door to dialogue, and I hope that it remains open. But either way, the community post linked to this article by Tayu Yaho, which was titled The Intellectual Limitations of People Using Haplogroups to Determine Ancient Tribal Lineage. And it's a short piece, so I wanted to just read through it really quickly and share my thoughts along the way. And I'm going to do so against the backdrop of our past discussions, my past discussions with the TEOTW twins on DNA. And I think we should be able to get through this really quickly. And we're just going to sort of freestyle it. So let's jump right in. First, we begin with the introduction, which reads as follows. In recent years, the use of genetic testing and haplogroup analysis has surged in popularity, offering individuals the chance to explore their ancestral roots and connect with their historical past. Among these pursuits, some have sought to link their genetic makeup directly to ancient tribes or specific historical figures, such as the Israelites, based on the presence of specific haplogroups. This approach, while intriguing, is often marred by scientific inaccuracies and a misunderstanding of how genetic markers function. We will delve into the scientific limitations of using haplogroups such as E1B1B to claim descent from ancient tribes like the Israelites. It will explain key concepts in genetics such as genetic drift, mutations, and natural selection, and demonstrate why these factors complicate the direct linkage of modern individuals to ancient lineages through haplogroups alone. And so here's his first section after the introduction. It's titled Misinterpretation of Genetic Markers. And he writes, haplogroups, which are groups of similar haplotypes that share a common ancestor with a single nucleotide polymorphism, or SNP, mutation, are often used to trace direct paternal or maternal lineages. Okay, let me pause right there to offer the comment that there is a bit of progress from past discussions here. I'd say that relates to a central disagreement which existed between the TEOTW twins and myself on the topic of genetics in our past discussions. And that point of dispute was with regard to whether haplogroups were the best avenue for assessing paternal lineages across millennia. In the past, it seemed the TEOTW twins wanted to offer some other approach, and they seemed to poo-poo the idea of using haplogroups to trace uniparental lineages, such as the strict paternal line or the strict maternal line. And therefore, I'd say that we've made some progress since then if they're now writing that haplogroups can be used to trace a direct paternal or maternal line, right? It seems to me that this article constitutes an obvious acknowledgement that haplogroups can be used to trace a direct paternal lineage, and I think that marks some progress since our past discussions. But with that, let's get back to the article. And so it continues. They, i.e. haplogroups, are helpful in understanding broad human migrations and the geographical distribution of genetic traits over millennia. However, they are less useful for pinpointing specific ethnic or tribal affiliations for several reasons. And so here's their first reason: common ancestry and divergent evolution. Haplogroups only indicate that individuals share a common distant ancestor who first exhibited a particular SNP mutation. Over thousands of years, descendants of this ancestor can spread over vast geographic areas and diversify into different ethnic groups due to genetic drift, mutations, and selection. For instance, the haplogroup E1B1B is prevalent in various populations across Africa and the Mediterranean, including Berbers, Ethiopians, and Balkan populations, reflecting a complex history of migrations rather than a single ethnic lineage. And if I can pause here, I would say that I agree. It has long been my contention that modern populations that number in the millions, whether they be Ashkenazi Jews or Arabs or Hispanics or African Americans, that all of these groups are patrilineally diverse, which is to say that multiple different paternal lines are found in each of these modern populations. And how do we know that? We know that from haplogroup studies, from explorations of what sort of haplogroups are prevalent and frequent within these different populations. So a particular paternal line might be mixed into multiple modern populations, and therefore, of course, you often can't demonstrate or determine membership in a modern population based merely on a haplogroup, especially if that population is not defined paternally. And indeed, a great many modern populations today are not restricted to just the paternal line. So we agree so far. I would go as far as to say that this was never a point of dispute, and this was always understood on my end. So I don't think this raises an objection to anything I proposed in our past discussions. But nonetheless, let's get back into it and consider their second reason, which is historical and archaeological evidence. And it reads as follows. Claims tying E1B1B directly to the ancient Natufians and thereby to modern groups like the Israelites often rely on sparse archaeological DNA evidence and broad assumptions about continuity between ancient and modern populations. The Natufians were a prehistoric culture in the Levant, and while they might share some genetic markers with modern populations, the direct lineage to specific historical groups like the Israelites is speculative without comprehensive genetic data from distinctly known Israelite remains. Okay, so here I'll just say touche. I'll agree that the connection between the Natufians and the Israelites remains speculative, right? But there is a broader discussion to be had there. And I'm sure the Tayu twins are familiar with some of that discussion, such as what are the major competing haplogroups proposed for the biblical Jacob? And I think in most discussions it's, E1B1B, J1, and so on. And then there's the question of the arguments that go with that. Now, admittedly, the arguments for a particular haplogroup are always going to employ an element of speculation, such as assumptions about whether the first linguistic Semites might have also been patrilineal Semites and so on, right? And people have reached different conclusions. Now, while we can say that all the arguments are imperfect and thus have some sort of potential margin of error, we can nonetheless discuss what is most probable. For example, I think most would agree that E1B1B and J1 are more likely than, say, R or Q or G. And while discussion on the Natufians can be part of that larger discussion, it would never hinge on just the Natufians, right? That's why I said it's part of a larger discussion. But whatever the case, let's get back to this article. And we come to a new section, which is titled Definitions of Genetic Concepts. And I don't think this is terribly relevant, but nonetheless, I'll read through this really quickly. He defines genetic drift as a mechanism of evolution that involves random changes in the frequency of alleles, variations of a gene, within a population over time. And this process can lead to significant genetic differences in small, isolated populations and is not driven by natural selection, but by chance. Second definition, mutations, permanent changes in the DNA sequence of an organism. Mutations can be beneficial, neutral, or harmful, and they are a primary source of genetic variation necessary for natural selection to act upon. Selection, or natural selection, the process where organisms with traits better adapted to their environment tend to survive and reproduce more than others. This leads to the gradual evolution of populations by increasing the frequency of beneficial traits and alleles. Okay, no objection there. Now we get to the section titled The Complexity of Genetic Inheritance. And they write, or Tayu writes, focusing on haplogroups to claim descent from biblical figures like Jacob, i.e. Israel, or his twin Esau also oversimplifies the complexity of genetic inheritance. And here's his reasons. Number one, multiple ancestral lines. Each individual has many ancestral lines, not just the paternal line, i.e. the Y chromosome, or the maternal line, i.e. mitochondrial DNA. A haplogroup represents only one of these lines, thus providing an incomplete picture of an individual's ancestry. Okay, and again, I agree here, but this is where the question of definitions comes in. Note that the Tayu twins used to hold to a patrilineal definition of Israelite. They later changed their mind about that, but many other Hebrew Israelites and certain other cultures still hold to patrilineal definitions of a particular group, such as the Israelites. Now, full disclosure, I myself do not hold to a patrilineal definition of Israelite. I think I've been very clear that I hold to an ecclesiastical definition. But nonetheless, emphasis on if others are working within a patrilineal framework, we can have a discussion within that assumption, within the assumption of that definition, of a patrilineal definition, and we can use haplogroups to gain interesting insights into that discussion. But let's get back to the article. Then we get to his second reason, twin genetics and descendants. And he writes, assuming that a haplogroup like E1B1B was indeed Jacob's, it would logically be Esau's as well, as they were twins. Thus, this haplogroup could equally represent descendants of Esau, not just Jacob. Moreover, it could also represent other descendants of their grandfather Abraham, such as the Moabites or the Edomites, diluting the specificity of any claim to Israelite heritage based on haplogroup alone. Okay, I'm in 100% agreement on this point, and I've been clear on this point for years. A mere haplogroup will not allow one to distinguish between a patrilineal Israelite and a patrilineal Edomite, but it can nonetheless be helpful in other ways. So, for example, as Tayu wrote, assuming that a haplogroup like E1B1B was indeed Jacob's, right? So that's what he wrote, so let's work within that assumption. That assumption would mean that those who lack that haplogroup or a downstream subclade of that haplogroup are therefore not patrilineal descendants of Jacob. That is to say, if Jacob's haplogroup was E1B1B, then we could say with confidence that those who have haplogroup R or haplogroup Q or haplogroup G do not descend paternally from Jacob. And that's where the value of haplogroups comes in. They might not allow us to distinguish between a patrilineal Israelite and a patrilineal Edomite, but if we settle on a particular haplogroup for Jacob, working within that framework, we can say who does not descend from Jacob. And I think that's significant. But let's get to Tayu's third point, which is diversity among descendants. He writes, over generations, descendants acquire mutations and mix with other populations, leading to a diversification of genetic profiles. The idea that all descendants of a figure like Jacob would maintain a singular identifiable haplogroup across thousands of years is genetically improbable due to recombination and introduction of new genetic variations. Okay, it seems to me that any patrilineal descendant of Jacob would either have Jacob's haplogroup or a subclade which is downstream from that haplogroup. And so with that in mind, I'd really like to ask Tayu to elaborate on what he intended to imply here, right? For example, did he intend to insinuate that even if Jacob had haplogroup E1B1B, it still might be possible for one of his patrilineal descendants to have haplogroup R or haplogroup Q? And I surely hope that was not his intention, but as it stands, it's quite vague, so I'd like to invite him to elaborate on that point. But nonetheless, let's get to his conclusion, where he writes, while genetic studies provide fascinating insights into human history and migrations, the use of haplogroups to establish direct, specific tribal or ethnic lineages, particularly for groups like the Israelites, is scientifically flawed. Such claims often overlook the complexities of genetic inheritance, the diversity of human populations, and the multitude of environmental and historical factors influencing genetic drift and selection. In essence, haplogroups can suggest possible connections or historical ties, but cannot conclusively prove descent from specific historical or biblical figures. This renders claims of direct descent from ancient tribes like the Israelites based on haplogroup analysis alone both scientifically unsupported, overly simplistic, and intellectually flawed. And then he had this interesting AI-generated image. Honestly, I suspect the article might have been AI-generated. But whatever the case, that's the end of the article. And what I would simply say is that if we are working within a patrilineal definition of Israelite, if, emphasis on if we are working within a patrilineal definition of Israelite, recourse to haplogroups would be our best tool for exploring modern claims on that topic. Now, admittedly, it wouldn't settle every question, but it could be used to assess a lot of things, like the tribes chart that One West has, or the assumption that every African American descends from Jacob, and so on, right? Or at least if the assumption that they all descend patrilineally from Jacob. Moreover, it would allow us to reach certain firm conclusions, like, for example, if Jacob had haplogroup G, then the overwhelming majority of African Americans would not be patrilineal descendants of Jacob, an idea that the Tayu twins themselves flirted with in the past. On the other hand, if Jacob had haplogroup E, then we can say confidently that men with haplogroup G, or haplogroup R for that matter, do not descend paternally from Jacob. And that's where recourse to haplogroups becomes valuable. And on a final note, recall that a major point of dispute between myself and the Tayu twins was on what alternative there might be for tracing paternal lines back across millennia. You see, in the past, they were claiming that autosomal DNA was a better tool in that regard, but I think it was clear that that was based on a rather flawed reasoning. So to sum up, I'd say that recourse to haplogroups is an imperfect tool, but nonetheless a valuable one, and perhaps the most valuable one for testing these claims. And with that, I'll stop here. I want to again express my appreciation for the tag in their community post, and I want to thank the Tayu twins for tagging me in that, and for apparently reopening the door to dialogue. I'd love to have a direct correspondence with them on this topic. Perhaps they could unblock me on Facebook and join or rejoin a neutral forum, like, for example, the Biblical Rumble Room on Facebook, or if they'd like to suggest another neutral forum, But the Biblical Rumble Room is where we first started our discussions on this topic, and that's a forum on Facebook. But whatever the case, I look forward to anything further from the Tayu twins on this topic. I hope that they keep the door to dialogue open. And in closing, I'll simply say that anyone, including the Tayu twins or their supporters, are free to comment on this video. In fact, you're invited to comment on this video. I don't censor anyone here. So feel free to share any comments, questions, criticisms, or objections. And God bless.